Greetings, ye mischievous gnomes. Today we'll be discussing the Hydra, but not just any old Hydra, the Lernian Hydra of Greek mythology. And we'll be seeing how it scores in our 5 categories among all monsters of the great mythologies out there. And these 5 categories, each with a max of 10 allowable points, except for the last one, are, as always, design, lore, powers and abilities, influence, and potential. So let's dive deep into these murkiest of waters. The Hydra initially was mostly based on the snake, which often invokes fear, so that's a great start. The head amounts are described as being from 9 to 50 to even 100, and I believe there's even some with only a few. And don't forget, the constellation inspired by this great beast has only one. As we will soon learn, that's a great starting point for this wonderful monster. The heads have been described or represented as serpentine heads, snake heads with some sort of beards, dragonoid heads, monkey/feline-like heads, and even dog-like heads. There's beaked heads, and some hydras even with a mix of various animal heads. With so many heads and so many variations, and well, the ability we'll discuss more later of growing more heads, originally this creature was more serpent-bodied. The later iterations showed 2 legs being added, or even 4, with a more dragonoid appearance, and sometimes even with multiple legs that aren't very reptilian or even vertebrate in nature, with overall anatomy displaying more crustacean-like features. What a wonderful curveball there if you're really trying to explore the anatomy of this thing. So for design, and because of all of this, the many heads, the different variations on the creature, the Hydra is such a satisfying embodiment for true animal lovers. I mean, a simple snake with many heads is already a wonderful thing to experience, but something more Drake-like, and not just that, but featuring mammalian heads, and then instead of just scales covering the whole body, you have chitin. That's such a nice complex mixture of biology. You can imagine how inspiring this is to future iterations we've already seen in movies, and other wonderful iterations we've seen in games. And there's still so many that can be depicted because we just haven't seen enough crustacean features in the more modern Hydra takes. So because of that openness of the design, the initial design and descriptions, and the lack of knowledge about animal biology at the time when this figment was given an appearance, no one can deny that this monstrosity has indeed a wonderful design and history of design. Therefore, we have to take into account the Hydra as being as something as simple as a snake with many branching off head and snake neck bits to the more complex ones that have legs and even wings. Therefore, looking at all of that, we have to find an average score in there, and I have to deem that score to be a 7 out of 10. And I said average as I do believe that more modern takes on this creature and even old depictions of this creature certainly deserve an 8 out of 10 or even higher. But again, we have to take everything that encompasses, or everything from Greek mythology that encompasses the path to this creature's classic presentation. As for lore, there are other Hydra-like monsters out there, such as an African monster that kept the rivers flowing, or one within the Bible that is more of a many-headed dragon. But those aside, with their individual specific names, of course deserving of their own videos, we have to judge the lore of this Greek offspring of Typhon and Echidna. Yes, 2 enormous, famous, great Greek gods. So the question here within lore is just how deep, how much of the lore on the Lernian Hydra is there? Well, we do know that the Cerberus is its sibling, and although that is more of a vicious doggo, it still has a wonderful thing in common with the Hydra, and that is having multiple heads. Other than that, not much more is known about the Hydra, its relationships, its anatomy, things like that. The main story that features the Hydra is one of Hercules, and where he sets out to accomplish initially 10 labors, and in the second labor, or quest, he was to slay the Lernian Hydra, which served as a guardian at the gates to the underworld. This encounter began with Hercules drawing out the Hydra from a cavern within the swampy depths with flaming arrows, and then proceeding to slicing the heads, which introduces the wonderfully mind-boggling highlight of this creature. As each time he sliced the head off, 2 would be regrown to replace its presence. In some tellings of the tale, there was one that was mortal, so if that one was removed, the Hydra would be defeated. But it didn't take long for Hercules and his nephew Iolaus, who was indeed helping him with this battle, to realize what was happening and how to find some sort of solution. And it was actually greatly because of Iolaus's help that Hercules and Iolaus defeated the great Hydra, as Hercules would chop off the heads and Iolaus would quickly follow behind with fire to smolder the flesh of the necks shut, which would prohibit any more growths or other unwelcome sort of healing. And interesting enough, Hera, not amused by any of this, sent a crab out, a giant crab. Actually, it would be quite fun to explore the details of that crab that she sent out to help the Hydra to defeat Hercules and Iolaus. But as soon as that crab appeared, Hercules stomped it to death and continued battling the reptilian demon. After cutting off the final head and learning of the Hydra's poisonous blood, Hercules dipped his golden sword of Athena into the bloody stump, imbuing his blade with the vile ooze, creating for an even better weapon. And again, there are different variations of this. In another one, he dipped his arrows into the blood instead. After all this, Hera placed the Hydra and the crab into the vault in the sky, making up the constellations of, well, the Hydra and Cancer for the crustacean. And finally, even though Hercules did win, this labor was dismissed, as again, he didn't defeat the Hydra alone, he had help. Eventually, Hercules had to overcome 12 total labors. But who cares about Hercules? This is all about that wonderful biological enigma that is the Hydra. And for this lore expressed here, and not much more to it, I have to hand the Hydra 5 out of 10 points for lore. I simply wish there was more to it. Maybe someday we'll uncover something more, or maybe someone already does, and I'll unearth it. But until that day, there just isn't enough out there that's really satisfying on the details of the Hydra. Of course, things can be expanded upon and all that, and new stories made up, but that does not relate to the original lore that is being judged here. So with that, let's move into the abilities, the powers and abilities. So let's throw the obvious out the window first, and that would be basic swimming capability, crawling, moving on the ground, to we're not sure what speeds exactly, so we'll just keep it at a basic ability, which would include, I would assume, climbing as well, as snakes are great climbers, and multi-legged creatures we can assume would be great climbers as well. Although being two-legged, that could be questionable. Again, putting this back at a basic level of this ability. The one we have to jump to immediately is the head regeneration, but not just regenerating one head, but multiple heads, and the speed of it. And we can imagine the rest of the regeneration along the body, even the tail being cut off or different parts of the bodies being sliced open. We can assume that the regeneration there is extremely speedy. There's also the ability of a tail whip and bites, venomous or not, which also leads us to the poisonous interior of this creature, as it can indeed spit poison and breathe out a poisonous gas, which is again featured in certain explanations of it. There is that question whether it is venomous or poisonous or both, although really in the quality here and the level of abilities, it's irrelevant, and being fully poisonous would be just enough because you would have the saliva surrounding the fangs, which would naturally give them easy and quick access into the wounds of foes. This is quite indeed a devastating power, as even if one were to accidentally place their hand or finger into an open wound of a Hydra, they would be quickly punished with what oozes within. And so moving from that and exploring other abilities of, well, snakes, and in particular snakes that don't have venom, is constriction. And the Hydra being seemingly more advanced than a regular snake, we could assume that constriction could quite possibly be in their combat bag of tricks. As far as just a quick mentioning of things that don't work so well for the Hydras, or shall we say weaknesses, it is a beastie. It is essentially described as more of an animal, which would mean it's not the most intelligent of creature out there. I mean, overall, its function is to simply guard the gates to hell, and then especially with a serpentine body, there's possibly that disadvantage of not having legs, and then as with most flesh encounters out there, fire does cauterize it and seal deep wounds, which prevents it from growing, in this case, more heads. And so also going back to the heads, many questions remain. Just what is the head limit? And let's say the Hydra wins a battle, and it wins with 50 heads in place. Do those heads remain forever? Is it forever a 50-headed Hydra or more? Does each head have a brain, or is there one main-brained head and the rest have smaller, simpler types of this organ, as we see in octopuses and other cephalopods? Again, because we just don't have that much lore on this creature, many of these questions remain, and that's sometimes a good thing too, because we can always expand upon it in our own creative ways. But for powers and abilities, with everything we have explored here, the Hydra in my book scores a 6 out of 10. There's a decent amount it can do, but there's also this whole other range that it seems not to step into, and some of it because of the nature of this creature, what it is, what its anatomy limits it to, and that includes the complexity of its brain as well. Moving onward, we're exploring the influence of the Hydra, basically how infamous this great monstrosity, or is it so great, monstrosity is. Well, it's got a great start, with the first line, which is, it's of Greek mythology, which in particular, as mythologies of the world go, Greek mythology has made quite an earth-shaking noise among humans. I mean, Romans aside, the real question for, well, many of us here involved with this video may be, how often do you think about Greek mythology every day? Ask your partner that question. But moving on with its influence, it was also born of two very famous parents. We have Typhon, a king of monsters, and Echidna, a queen of monsters, who have birthed many other very famous monsters, some more so than the Hydra itself. So that definitely adds a few points right there. Then there's that whole ability that really stands out, the multi-head regrowth ability. It's so memorable because of what it is, but then also the symbology of it, which we'll come back to in a moment. The Hydra monster has also appeared in heraldry and on coats of arms here and there, as it's a wonderfully powerful and intimidating monster, just like the dragons. Its adaptations have been very welcomed in movies and video games, and its head regrowth features on other monsters, so its influence has certainly penetrated through other fields of monsters out there and story plots. The deadly branching out network of the heads also inspired a Hydra organization in the beloved Marvel universe, which in itself created a very, very famous slogan of Hail Hydra. Slogan or just a saying, whatever. This is so well known that even for those that never knew what a Hydra is, they already look into the imagery of it and are soon aware of at least a good portion of this creature's existence, if even only the physical silhouette. And that silhouette even inspired the name of an actual creature, which is a very tiny, very fascinating organism that most any of us can go out to a local river and find these little hydras, pick them up and keep them in a jar, so long as your eyes can really enjoy the tiny presence of these living embodiments of a classic monster of mythology. As these real hydras that continue thriving today have these many small tendrils reminiscent of the hydra's many necks and heads. And it is indeed predatory. I do recommend that you quickly educate yourself on what Hydra organisms are and how simply neat of a little creature we have in our backyard, some of us literally. But now going back to that Hydra symbolism, it may tell an educational tale, such as one where seemingly an issue is solved only to become multiple more issues. Or sort of the other side of this, a symbol of renewal that enforces the idea of life persisting in the face of destruction. It's actually very symbolic of nature and how nature finds a way. And so what a wonderful inspiration for an army's strategy as well. For this reach of influence and in a variety of areas, I must give the Hydra an 8 out of 10. It's quite up there, but go outside, talk to your neighbors, and see how many people of various societies and cultures do actually know the details of what a Hydra is. As for potential, just how much potential is there within this wonderful beast for expansion or seeing more of? What mostly limits such a creature from being expanded upon and having countless reappearances is its primal simplicity. In the end, it's just a creature of the bestiaries and not complex enough with societal dilemmas and cultural intricacies. It's more or less an animal. But what an awesome one. And in this case, when I say animal, more along the lines of animals as we know them in this reality on Earth. And even though it is just an animal by these terms, I still find it most fascinating, and I'd love to see more exploration on it pushed. Referring to those questions I asked earlier, as well as many others, as it really is an intriguing monster, especially with the variety of different depictions throughout history. And let's be honest, we just don't see enough quality Hydras out there. I'd wager to say we see more Krakens done justice than these unique scaly predators. So is there potential for more for our beloved Hydra? I'd say a definite maybe. We're not quite there at a full yes, but I'm quite confident with a maybe. And as we move toward the final verdict, I have to disclaim one more thing, as I do believe the Hydra, the Lernian Hydra, by all that we've looked into and covered, deserves a seal of approval, a stamp of badassery, as it doesn't just look cool and frightening, it is a powerful foe. It doesn't have an immense amount of abilities, but the ones it has are not to be taken lightly, and if encountered in an unfriendly manner, are required to be dealt with extremely swiftly and carefully. So huzzah to you, great Hydra. And as our trusty goblins make the final calculations on what tier the Hydra stands on among all monsters of mythology, I must thank our supporters at Patreon for keeping the torches of this channel aflame. And don't you forget, your requests for the monsters you want to see in the next video with the most likes enter the Patreon voting poll, where together we as a community make the decision of the next monster to be featured in a review video. So thank you all ye monsterites. Now, as for the verdict, the Lernian Hydra earns its very respectable position on the high end of B tier, almost crossing to A tier. All in all, it's just not complex enough of a being to put it among the top crescent of all mythological monsters, but the many factors that make it such an enjoyable encounter to experience solidify it as a classic monster that will forever roam the halls of monster fame. Personally, not only am I a fan of the sort of animals that inspire the Hydra, the toxicity of the blood and saliva really adds to its indestructible edge and my appreciation of the creature, and so having to deem it worthy of that seal of approval. On top of that, the symbolism it artistically depicts is unforgettable and well presented. Did you know? Further justifying that the Hydra's hazardous bodily fluids are indeed a big deal is the fact that there is a mentioning or two that a mere touch upon it may bring upon death, presenting it as extremely acidic in nature, not just some poisonous liquid, but a destructive, corrosive goo that one is best staying completely away from, to the point where you're not even breathing any of its possible fumes or even odor. And so what a deadly fiend it is, as it's best to keep a distance from it, but in order to win you still must remove those heads, which usually requires close combat. What a dilemma of a creature. Oh, and if you haven't had enough of the sticky deadly substance, there is indeed another creature, well, questionably creature, with very much such a destructive blood running through their veins. And that is the Xenomorph of the Alien franchise, which has been reviewed, and you can check that out right here.